You ever notice something interesting about people who drain your energy, steal your peace, and disturb your focus? They don't usually attack your dreams directly at first. No, they don't show up saying, "I'm here to destroy your life." They show up smiling. They show up familiar. They show up sounding like they care. But make no mistake, their real assignment is not connection. It is contamination. And here's what most people don't understand. Toxic people don't respect love. They don't respect kindness. And they don't respect patience. Those things don't move them. You could forgive them 7 times, 70 times, 700 times, and they will still push the same pattern, because the issue was never your reaction. The issue is their nature. Now listen carefully, because this is where transformation begins. There is one boundary, just one, that toxic people cannot handle. They can argue with your words, they can challenge your emotions, they can manipulate your feelings, but there is one line they cannot cross without losing access to you completely. And that boundary is your refusal to lose yourself in order to keep them. Let that settle in your mind. The moment you decide that your peace is non-negotiable, something changes in the invisible atmosphere around your life, because toxic people are not afraid of your love. They are afraid of your limit. They are not threatened by your kindness. They are threatened by your clarity. They are not disturbed by your generosity. They are disturbed when you finally decide, "I will not betray myself to maintain access to you." See, most people are trained from childhood to believe that being good means being accessible. Being kind means being available. Being loving means tolerating everything. But that is not love. That is self-abandonment dressed up as loyalty. And toxic people thrive in environments where self-abandonment is normalized. Because if you abandon yourself, they never have to fight you. They just have to pressure you. They just have to push a little, withdraw a little, guilt you a little, and you will do the rest to yourself. But something powerful happens when you stop participating in your own destruction. The first time you say no without explaining it, they get confused. The first time you don't over-explain your boundary, they get uncomfortable. The first time you don't rush to fix their emotional reaction to your limit, they get exposed. Because now they are not dealing with a person they can shape. They are dealing with a person who has structure. And structure is something manipulation cannot penetrate. Toxic people don't leave because you stopped loving them. They leave because they lost leverage over you. And leverage only exists where your identity is negotiable. Let me go deeper. Every toxic dynamic survives on emotional access. If they can get you angry, they still control you. If they can get you guilty, they still control you. If they can get you explaining yourself for 3 hours just to justify a simple boundary, they still control you. But when you reach the point where your no is complete, calm, and final, something in them recognizes a problem they cannot solve. Because now they cannot argue you into abandonment. They cannot guilt you into surrender. They cannot confuse you into compliance. And that is the boundary they fear the most. Not distance, not silence, not anger, clarity. Because clarity removes confusion, and without confusion, manipulation dies instantly. Now I want you to imagine something. Imagine a person who has spent years benefiting from your emotional flexibility. You adjusted, you tolerated, you compromised, you explained, you re-explained. You gave second chances that turned into lifestyles. And suddenly one day you stop. Not with drama, not with revenge, not with anger. Just stop. You don't argue anymore. You don't over-explain anymore. You don't chase understanding anymore. You simply decide, this is where I end and where you begin, and I will no longer cross myself to reach you. That moment feels like loss to them, but it is actually exposure. Because now they can no longer hide their behavior behind your reaction. And here is the uncomfortable truth most people avoid. Toxic people don't fear losing you. They fear losing control over how you see yourself while dealing with them. As long as you keep questioning your worth, they stay comfortable. As long as you keep wondering if you're too sensitive, they stay in power. As long as you keep asking, am I the problem? They never have to change. But the moment you stop questioning your value and start observing their pattern without emotional distortion, the relationship shifts. Not because they changed, but because you did not abandon yourself to interpret them anymore. And that is the beginning of freedom. Because freedom is not the absence of toxic people. Freedom is the absence of internal negotiation with toxicity. When you no longer negotiate with what drains you, You stop needing permission to protect yourself. And when you stop needing permission, you become untouchable in that area of your life. And toxic people cannot function around untouchable energy. They need access. They need entry points. They need emotional doors left slightly open so they can keep stepping in and out of your peace like it belongs to them. But once that one boundary is fully established, once your self-respect becomes the gatekeeper of your life, something shifts permanently. And they feel it before you even say another word, because they realize they are no longer dealing with someone they can slowly erase. They are dealing with someone who remembers themselves. Now listen closely, because what happens next is where most people either reclaim their life or repeat their cycle. The moment you establish that boundary, the moment you stop abandoning yourself to maintain access to someone else, the reaction is almost never immediate respect. It is resistance. And that resistance is not random. It is predictable. Because whenever a system loses control over you, it will attempt to reassert influence through pressure. Toxic people don't respond to boundaries the way healthy people do. Healthy people adjust. Toxic people test. They test your memory of your own decision. They test your emotional stability. They test your guilt reflex. They test how long you can tolerate discomfort before you return to old patterns. And the testing is subtle at first, a message sent at the wrong time, a tone that carries familiarity but not accountability, a reminder of how good things used to be before you started changing. Or sometimes silence, because silence is also a tool. Silence designed to make you question whether your boundary was too harsh, too extreme, too unnecessary. And here is where the battle actually happens. Not in what they do, but in what you do next. Because the old version of you would respond immediately, explain, soften, reconnect, justify, repair, reopen the door slightly to keep the peace. But the new version of you understands something critical. Peace that requires self-betrayal is not peace at all. It is compliance dressed as harmony. And compliance always comes with a cost. That cost is identity. Now let me show you something deeper. Toxic dynamics survive because they create emotional confusion. And confusion is not just discomfort, it is control. Because a confused mind is a negotiable mind. When you are confused, you ask questions like, did I overreact? Am I being too harsh? Maybe I should give another chance. Maybe they didn't mean it that way. And every one of those questions is a reopening of the boundary you just tried to build. So what do toxic patterns do when they sense clarity forming? They attack clarity. They introduce doubt into your certainty. They don't need to break your boundary physically. They only need to make you question whether you had the right to build it in the first place. Because once you question your right to protect yourself, you will eventually dismantle your own protection system. But something changes when you begin to recognize the pattern instead of participating in it. You start to see that the emotional waves they create are not accidents, they are strategies. Not always conscious strategies, but patterns that repeat because they work on people who have not yet anchored themselves. And here is the uncomfortable truth most people never want to admit. You cannot heal in an environment that depends on your confusion. Because healing requires clarity, and clarity requires distance from distortion. So when you enforce that boundary, the one that says, I will not lose myself to maintain this connection, you are not just rejecting a person. You are rejecting an entire system of emotional manipulation that has been running silently in the background. And systems don't like being exposed, so they escalate, sometimes through guilt, sometimes through victim narratives, sometimes through sudden kindness designed to blur your memory of why you stepped back in the first place. But all of it has one goal: restore access. Because once access is restored, control is restored. And that is why the most important phase of boundary setting is not the announcement, it is the maintenance. Anyone can declare a boundary in a moment of emotion. Very few people can maintain it when pressure begins. Because maintenance requires emotional discipline. It requires you to sit in discomfort without converting it into action that destroys your progress. It requires you to feel the pull without obeying it. It requires you to understand that withdrawal is not always loss. It is often detox. And detox feels like chaos before it feels like clarity. But here's where strength is formed. Not in the moment you set the boundary, but in the moment you refuse to break it when breaking it would feel easier. That is where identity is forged. Because every time you resist the urge to revert back, you are not just saying no to them, you are saying yes to yourself. And that yes is what toxic systems cannot predict. They can predict guilt. They can predict emotional reaction. They can predict inconsistency. But they cannot predict someone who has decided that self-respect is no longer optional. And when they realize that, something interesting happens. They start to lose interest not because you became less valuable, but because you became less controllable. And for toxic dynamics, control is more important than connection. So when control disappears, the illusion of connection often follows. But what remains is something far more powerful than the relationship you lost. What remains is you, no longer split between who you are and who you had to become to survive someone else's behavior. And that version of you, stable, aware, unshakable in your boundary, is the beginning of a completely different life trajectory, not because the world changed, but because you stopped negotiating with what was quietly costing you everything.